discussing and having somehow more space, and instead we don't want that. I suggest that we listen first both papers and then have the discussion of both papers at the end together. Having said that, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kirsi Salonen of the University of Turku. Although I saw that she also started very recently a collaboration with the University of Bergen, so I don't know from where she is following us now, she will tell us. And she's specialist of modern history, but also legal history. And she will speak about the borders, but taking a look from them from the very center, let's say, also because she's an expert of the Vatican archives and the Apostolic penitentiaries, used as a lens also to investigate the Finnish society of the late Middle Ages, early modern period. I just would like to recall two other things about her. First is a very recent book about papal justice in the late Middle Ages, the Sacra Romana Rota, came out last year, if I saw correctly. And now also that she is leading a project about strategies of survival, the Papal Curia and the ecclesiastical institution of Rome in the Great Western Schism. And today she will present a reflection about the topic of Apostolic Penitentiary and Inquisition. Thank you to be with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you all see my PowerPoint now, or have I done something wrong?
Yes, very well.
Okay, good. Good. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. Unfortunately, I couldn't come. I have teaching starting at 12 o'clock, so I have to be here. I am actually now currently in Norway, in Bergen, but still also at the University of Turku. And I was asked to present here in the conference the Apostolic Penitentiary and Inquisition, and I will present in my presentation the sources of the Apostolic Penitentiary and what they can tell us about the Inquisition in the late Middle Ages. I have structured my presentation so that I begin with the presenting of the penitentiary and what kinds of cases it has dealt with. Then I take a quick look at the research done by the penitentiary scholars regarding the Inquisition. And finally, I present you some examples from the penitentiary archives in order to give you a concrete idea about what kinds of cases related to Inquisition the penitentiary has handled and what can be also found in the penitentiary archives, because it's extremely interesting also for Inquisition scholars.
Kirsi, you deactivated the audio, I guess, accidentally. Yeah, now it's coming. Try now, please. Now should be active. Try to speak, please.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, sorry. We heard the presentation just when you moved to the first slide, we lost your voice.
Yeah, there was, I don't know what is happening. My computer is not totally Microsoft Teams compatible. In any case, the penitentiary was the papal office that took care of matters concerning sins and crimes against the regulation of the ecclesiastical legislation, that is canon law. Christians who had problems with ecclesiastical norms could turn to the penitentiary with a petition. Cases brought before the penitentiary were typically reserved to the papal authority, crimes like clerical homicide or heresy, but the office handled also matters belonging to the episcopal authority, like sortilege or magic. The penitentiary had the authority to grant 4 different types of grace. 1, absolutions for those who had broken the regulations of canon law in a particularly severe way. 2, dispensations that allowed Christians to act against the regulations of the church, for example, to marry a close relative or become a priest despite an impediment such as illegitimacy. 3, licenses that allowed Christians to deviate from the normal Christian obligations, for example, confessing to priests other than their own parish priest or consuming forbidden products during the fasting periods. And 4, official declarations in various matters. And this means that the penitentiary could declare that a cleric was not guilty of murder or that a marriage or a monastic profession was void. According to these powers, the penitentiary could grant graces in numerous matters. The large spectrum of the authorities of the office is also reflected in the structure of its records, which are survived almost entirely from the mid-15th century onwards. Unfortunately, especially for those interested, for example, in Catars, no earlier records from the office have survived centrally. The penitentiary registers, which in almost all types of instances contain abbreviated copies of the incoming and approved petitions, are internally divided into different sections, each of them containing petitions of certain type. The titles of the 7 most common categories you can see here on the left side of the slide. We have De Matrimonialibus, in which are registered petitions concerning marriage matters. The Diversis Formis is the most heterogeneous of the petition categories and contains cases related to various crimes and sins against the regulations of canon law. Here we have violence, murder, apostasy, simony, for example, but also many dispense and license matters like changing the monastery or commuting vows. In the declaratories category, we find the petitions related to the earlier mentioned official declarations, while in the categories De Defectu Natalium and De Uberiori, we find supplication in which the petitioners desired to enter ecclesiastical career despite they were illegitimate children. De Promotis et Promovendis category contains petitions related to issues in ecclesiastical ordinations, and the De Confessionalibus category, there are registered petitions for licenses to choose a personal confessor. And the division of the penitentiary records, it is a very handy tool for researchers because it makes the search of certain types of documents much easier since there are no indexes in the penitentiary volumes. For those who are interested about the documents related to Inquisition, the Diversis Formis category is the right one. The penitentiary records contain 2 kinds of documents relevant for the study of Inquisition. For the first, the penitentiary had the powers to deal with certain issues that were often handled by the inquisitors as well. For example, the office could grant absolutions for Christians who were guilty of magic, sortilege, witchcraft, heresy, or who had had illicit contacts with Muslims or Jews. For the second, the office has handled cases that were connected to local Inquisition processes. And from 1480s onwards, these are mainly Spanish cases, sort of from the Spanish Inquisition. All in all, these cases were not part of the daily business of the penitentiary. We are talking about sort of 10 cases per year, perhaps, when the office handled each year about 3,000 petitions. I promised also to say something about the state of the art in the penitentiary scholarship regarding the study of Inquisition. And I think I have promised a little bit too much. I thought it would be easier, but when I started looking at this, there was actually very little what I can talk about. The penitentiary material is simply all too little known among the Inquisition scholars, and I have not heard anybody from the Inquisition scholars to studying the penitentiary material. It might be my mistake, and please correct me if that is. But what I am presenting here is actually the works by penitentiary scholars who have been done something regarding the issues related to the Inquisition. It is not possible to talk about the penitentiary and Inquisition without mentioning Filippo Tamburini's books. Tamburini, who died in 1999, was the archivist of the penitentiary and very much interested about curious cases among the penitentiary records. In 1996, he published the book Ebrei Saraceni Cristiani, Vita Sociale e Vita Religiosa dai Registri della Penitenziaria Apostolica, which contains a short introduction to the penitentiary material and an edition of 46 documents regarding various issues in the relationships between Christians and Jews or Muslims. Another seminal book is Heresy und Luthertum, Quellen aus dem Archiv der Penitentiarie in Rome. It is an edition of 48 documents regarding heresy, many of them Lutheran heretics, but also others, collected again by Filippo Tamburini, and the book has also an introduction written by him. The book is edited and commented after the death of Tamburini by Professor Ludwig Schmugger, another grand old man of the penitentiary research. In addition to these source publications, one should mention the huge collection of documents published in the Repertorium Penitentiarii Germanicum under the direction of Ludwig Schmugger. That includes also numerous documents related to Hussites and Lutherans, of which Schmugger has also written some articles. Regarding Hussites, it's worth mentioning Lucy Dolezalova's article, But If You Marry Me, Reflections of the Hussite Movements in the Penitentiary, and that is from 2004. All these works are based on the material in the late medieval penitentiary registers. But there are also studies concerning the penitentiary and Inquisition that are based on other kinds of penitentiary sources, also earlier ones. And here I would like to refer to the publications of Arnaud Fossien, who has dealt with penitentiary and Inquisition in the 14th centuries. But as I said, these are out of my competence, so I won't go more in details in here, but I hope this could at least give you some kind of idea about the state of the art. And now let us take a look at the documents in the penitentiary archives. As I said, the penitentiary could deal with similar sins or crimes that the Inquisition did. And here come a few examples of cases related to magic, sortilege, witchcraft, and heresy. Since I wanted to show you a broad spectrum of different cases, I will not go into details with each case here, but just quickly present them so that you get an idea of the spectrum of cases one can find in the penitentiary archives. My first example is a combination of sacrilege and magic, in which the supplicant, Elvira Martini from Sevilla, was guilty of use of love potions. She told the penitentiary that she had hoped that a certain young man would fall in love with her daughter, and therefore she had taken a portable altar from a church and turned it into powder that she gave to the man, with the intention that it would cause friendship between the young persons. Her act had caused her excommunication, from which she asked to be absolved by the penitentiary. The second example is the case of Gundis Salvus Johannes, a priest from Porto, who had carried a consecrated host with him in order to keep his enemies away. He explained that when this had come to the knowledge of the local bishop, the bishop had deposed Gundis Salvus from altar service. Gundis Salvus, who did not carry the host for harming anyone, asked from the penitentiary for absolution so that he could continue in his priestly profession. My third example concerns treasure hunting through magic. Brother Petrus de Cullar, abbot of the Benedictine monastery of St. John de Corias in the Diocese of Oviedo, explained that he had learned that there was an ancient treasury in his monastery, and he had performed different magic for finding it, without any result though. Because of this, he had incurred excommunication and needed absolution and dispensation so that he could continue in his monastic career. The penitentiary granted him that, and as you can see from below, with the condition that he had renounced the use of sortilege and incantations and burned all the books that contained information about that. In my fourth example, Johanna, daughter of Robin Canteloup from Chartres, explained that she and her mother had once returned from a visit to a dying woman, when devil appeared to her twice in the form of, and now I quote, you can see it with the red, big black man with horn-shaped ears and his eyes flaming in a terrible way, unquote. Then, during the night, when she was lying in her bed, both awake and asleep, she saw the same vision several times, lost her senses and intellect, and thus, as insane, recanted God and Virgin Mary, as well as all saints, and donated several times her body and soul to devil and the malign spirit. In the moment of petitioning for absolution from the penitentiary, she had already returned to the Catholic faith and regretted what she had done. I find this a very curious case because the petition includes an unusually detailed description about the facts and also of the devil. And I suspect that there has been something else behind this petition than only her deep religious regret for what had happened. It is indeed possible that she had ended up in the hands of the local inquisitors and had been accused of witchcraft, and that she has applied to the penitentiary, thinking that the letter of grace from the office would help her to prove her innocence to her accusers. This might even have saved her from being sentenced to capital punishment because of witchcraft. Dozens of clients of the penitentiary had profited economically from illicit contacts to Muslims and traded forbidden goods. One of them was Constantinus Oregi, a layman from Venice, who was guilty of selling to infidels unum puncerum, which is some sort of sharp weapon, and 200 small knives suitable for daily use. And the daily use means for cutting bread and not really suitable for being weapons. He received from the penitentiary an absolution with the condition that he paid the Pope an equivalent sum to what he had profited from his trade. The penitentiary documentation contains also numerous petitions from Christians who had had contacts with heretics or themselves participated in heretical movements. Since we are dealing with material from the mid-15th century, many of them concern relations to the Hussites. For example, Augustinus Tristanus from Salzburg had been in the army of heretic Bohemians, while it committed many crimes like theft, arson, and homicide. He, however, claimed that he had not participated in committing them and asked for absolution, which the penitentiary granted him with the condition that he had returned to the Catholic faith. It was not only the Hussites who attracted good Catholics, but a group of persons from the Diocese of Turin asked for absolution from excommunication because they had joined the sect of the paupers of Lyon, that is the Waldensians, but returned back to the womb of the Mother Church. They too were absolved by the penitentiary with the condition that they had abjured the heresy. The penitentiary granted graces also to Christians who had abandoned the Mother Church and become Jews. Belvaldus Alfonsi and his wife Isabetta Sanchi from Seville explain that they had given up the Christian faith and converted to Judaism. Belvaldus had even let himself to be circumcised. The penitentiary granted for the couple the absolution they needed, but also this time conditionally. The grace would be valid only after they had given up the sect and returned to the right faith. And then it is time to present you some penitentiary documents that are directly related to local Inquisition processes. In these cases, which are typically from the Spanish territory and from the period after the establishing of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, the petitions have ended up in the hands of the local inquisitors and turned to the penitentiary for cleansing their conscience and reputation. And as you will see, also for seeking protection from the local inquisitors. I have here two examples that I have taken from Tamburini's Ebrei Saraceni Christiani. My first example continues from the previous case of Belvaldus Alfonsi and Isabetta Sanchi, who had converted to Judaism. And the case is actually so long that I have not copied it here in the Latin form as the other examples I had, but used only Tamburini's Italian summary. In this case, Diaco di Sancio de Jubera, a priest from Calahorra, explained that he had been imprisoned by the Spanish Inquisition that accused him of heresy because it was claimed that he had stated that the synagogue was a place of prayer and that the Jew could be saved in the same way as a good Christian. In addition to imprisonment, he had been declared irregular to act in his priestly office. He also explains that he had ended up in the hands of Inquisition because his mother had first been condemned of heresy. Diaco, however, had been released from prison and he had repented and done his penitence, and now he petitioned for absolution and dispensation so that he could continue in his priestly career, which the penitentiary granted to him. My second example concerns a couple from Cordova, Bernardo de Corduba and Maria Alfonsi, who explained that the inquisitors appointed by Pope Alexander VI had found out that they had participated in Jewish rites and ceremonies. The inquisitors had not caught Maria, but they had imprisoned Fernandus, who was released after the death of the Borgia Pope. Now the couple turned to the penitentiary and asked for absolution from heresy and apostasy. Interesting here is the final clause of the penitentiary, in which it is stated that the executors of the grace should absolve the petitioners and to make sure that the inquisitors would not bother the couple. If nothing else, this clause proves that Christians use the penitentiary documentation against the local Inquisition or inquisitors. And then I come to my short conclusions. I have shown that the penitentiary records include two kinds of relevant material for Inquisition scholars. On the one hand, the penitentiary has dealt with similar kind of issues than the Inquisition, and on the other hand, the office has handled cases in which the petitioners have had issues with the local Inquisition. In these cases, the petitioners have used the penitentiary documents as testimony of their innocence and perhaps been saved from punishment. As I said, it is impossible to know the motives of the petitioners who have asked for absolution in cases of magic, witchcraft, or heresy. But it is possible that at least some of these cases are related to local Inquisition processes, although this is not explicitly stated in the petitions. It would be really interesting if we could find these persons in the records of the local inquisitors or compare the cases in the penitentiary with the local records. And finally, although the small number of cases related to Inquisition among the penitentiary records demonstrates that these matters were not everyday business for the office, the existence of these petitions shows that Christians were sometimes guilty of these sins and they knew that the penitentiary could help them. Thank you very much. Now I can't hear what you are saying.
now you should, I guess. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for this nice presentation that show how rich can be this kind of source about topics related with Inquisition, but also in general. So I guess it was very fruitful for our discussion. And I will now introduce our second speaker, and then we can have the discussion of your paper and the other together after the second presentation. And yeah, it's fine for you to be there. Okay, perfect. So our second speaker is Professor Violet Soen of the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven in Belgium, Flanders. Is a very political issue, any choice you do in this case. But she's a renowned professor of early modern history with an interest in the aristocratic networks in the Borderlands during the War of Religions, but also on the attempts to reconciliate, let's say, during the Dutch Revolt, the unity of the peace under the Habsburg. That was the topic of one of her books, Fred Handel, that can be translated as Attempt to Peace or something like that, I guess. And also quite recently, she achieved to co-edit 3 volumes on the Council of Trent, Roman and Controversy in Europe and Beyond, 2018. And with her speech, she will bring us to the borderlands, between Low Countries and France, I guess, or in that confused area that we will hear from her, and the role of Inquisition, of course, in that area. I'll try to put it. Should be visible now.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. I hope this is going well for the audience here and the audience abroad. So thank you for the invitation and the occasion to shed some light on religious persecution in the Low Countries, and indeed today's topic will be to conceptualize the Low Countries as borderlands. Writing about the Inquisition in the Low Countries remains a conceptual challenge. Religious repression in these lowlands and the North Sea, so this is Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and some parts of Northern France, they do not really fit into more well-known patterns of early modern persecution of heresy, like those in Spain, in the Empire, or in France. And earlier, I have argued to understand the Inquisition in the Habsburg Netherlands as a system sui generis, in which religious repression was managed at 4 or maybe 5 different levels, and as a result of the persecution of Soen orthodoxy could take place at 4 levels. Maybe it could happen by local officials on the basis of anti-heresy law. It could happen by episcopal tribunals and courts. It could happen by inquisitors with the papal permission, so most of Dominicans. And it also could happen by inquisitors generals, which were theologians appointed by the prince, but endorsed by the court. And in fact, my start to Inquisition studies was a kind of biographical or political biography of one of those inquisitors general, Michael Bias, who most of you will maybe know as a theologian, who's famous for introducing again Augustinian thought into scholastic teachings at the University of Leuven. He was the precursor of Celsius, but in his theological activities, he also was Inquisitor General for the whole Low Country. And so together then with one of my colleagues at Leuven, Kirsi, we, in 2015, we published an article which was very much inspired by Richard Kickhever's article on inquisitorial offices, and we argued that if you want to narrow the Inquisition down to the Inquisitors General, to that level, that maybe it's better not to think of it as an institution, but to think of it as a function, as an office, and it's an office which is changing. But today, in this contribution, I will approach the multi-level management of everything from a Borderlands perspective, which is the theme I have been working on more recently together with the team of researchers at the Early Modern History Department in Leuven. And so the Low Countries, they functioned as a twilight zone, a typical borderlands between France and the Empire, but they also became gradually part of the dominions ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, and then eventually they became the most northern frontier of the Spanish monarchy. And I will show you that the borderland position accounted for this multi-level management of religious repression, but that it also steered to rather unexpected trans-regional transfers in the broader field of early modern Catholicism. And so as we were invited to make a stock of recent developments in historiography in our specific field, I will walk you through some of the articles and books we've produced in my team. So the outline of today is first introduce you to how we see or conceptualize Borderlands and how Borderland perspectives can help to decenter and to entangle other master narratives. Then a second section will be again about conceptualizing Inquisition or religious persecution in, so we've heard this yesterday in several talks, deconstructing the machinery and showing that somehow all these different levels and different overlapping jurisdictions made it somehow a jurisdictional patchwork. And then we will show that in the third section that transregional history can, at first sight, look, or Borderlands can look to be at the periphery, but often they're at the center, and they are the crucial hubs for transfers. So let's start with the borderland perspective. And borders and borderlands are gradually, again, attracting attention in historiography of early modern origin. And this is more than warranted, as early modern borders have often been understood as intersections of land and power only, as if mainly been studied from the perspective of state building. In this older type of border research, boundaries were studied to identify the differences between territories, from one territory to another, focusing more on how borders created separations rather than connections. So historians would focus less on what transcended the limits or how borderlands could function as places in between or as distinctive zones. And it's only recently, with regard to the frontiers of the New World, where the traditional category of state formation seems somehow superfluous, that Lauren Benton or Tamar Herzog, for example, have developed a new conceptual approach to border spaces as distinctive yet connected zones. And so, within our team of transregional history at Leuven, we chose for a similar approach by going beyond the frontier or the singular border. And we always start with the premise that the border did not exist. It was a border between many overlapping delimitations. So we always have an interplay between political, religious, confessional, social, linguistic, feudal, jurisdictional borders. In this perspective, transregional history is not about a predefined scale. So we don't say this is the region you should study. It can be a parish, it can be a province, it can be a larger polity. But we want to focus on the ways in which these different spatial scales coexist and how actors always switched between different levels. So we've written a methodological contribution on that in the Journal of Early Modern History, but in 2015 we invited a series of Reformation scholars in Leuven to think and to introduce this perspective, and so that led to that volume on transregional reformations. But today I'm glad to start this conversation also with Inquisition scholars and to see how the approach of Borderlands history and the approach of Inquisition studies can actually be can create overlaps. And so, indeed, the Low Countries often functioned as a border zone. They're the quintessential borderlands of medieval and early modern Europe. In the medieval times, they were this fraction zone. I often call them tectonic plates between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. And so there's new polities, the Burgundian polity, coming into being, always with a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of war, of course, and annexations. Gradually, they become part of this larger Habsburg world. This is not without, it's not an easy transition. There are a lot of voices at that time advocating that the Low Countries should again be part of the Kingdom of France. But as such, they become part of the Spanish monarchy. So traditionally, we think about the Low Countries like it is in the mid-16th century. There are 17 provinces. They're all united. They've been loosened by Emperor Charles V of the Kingdom of France, of the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of France. And they're actually incorporated within the Holy Roman Empire as a Burgundian circle. And you see that a decade later, they try also to realign ecclesiastical borders with the new political borders. So there's a whole new bishopric division, which, of course, it's not fully overlapping, because there's always a corridor of the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, so this has never been one block of a really closed territory, and there are always enclaves, and the enclaves are especially the bishops, so the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, and as we will see, the Bishopric of Cambrai, which will be crucial to today's story. And so, at the beginning of the 16th century, there's of course the episcopal jurisdiction. There have been the witch hunts and the Borderlands, so there have been a lot of religious persecution. But the start of the new Inquisition in the 16th century starts with the repression of the Reformation of Lutheranism, especially. And that will be the connecting thread into the rest of the century. So, whereas in Spain or Portugal, the focus is really on persecuting Jews or Moriscos or Maranos, or here in the Low Countries, the focus is on convicting or finding sectarians, they're called in the beginning, so people of sects, and the sects can be the Lutherans. Then in the first decade, it's often what they call the sacramentarians, so people who think of a spiritual connotation for sacraments. Then the Anabaptists, there's a huge repression of Anabaptists, and eventually it's their main focus is the repression of Calvinism. But this whole new structure and how people or how bishops and the whole elites wanted to repress the new forms of Lutheranism and the new forms of Christianity was in fact based on the imperial blueprint. The Edict of Worms, the Diet of Worms, actually gets translated into French and translated to Dutch, and that's how anti-heresy legislation gets pronounced or gets promulgated in the Low Countries. And this is not so easy as it seems, because at that time there were not yet 17 provinces, there were about 10. And for every 10 of the provinces, there's a separate edict of worms, a separate translation. And for example, in the county of Flanders, where the emperor has more princely power, they're harsher punishments. And for example, in the county of Holland, where his power is more disputed. And so in the past decade, it has become clear that actually the imperial blueprint outperformed, I would say, the Spanish blueprint. Traditionally, people think, oh, the Netherlands, they're part of the Spanish Empire, it's the Spanish Inquisition. You read that in a lot of propaganda, but in fact, the basic model was the imperial blueprint, even if Spanish councillors are advising the Emperor Charles V to install some kind of holy office for the Low Countries. Then a third blueprint is what I would call an influence is the French blueprint, where you see that universities or the University of Leuven gets a lot of power in containing heresy. So, of course, the University of Leuven has the doubtful reputation to be the first, together with Cologne, the first academic institution to condemn Luther. But this academic condemnations really, like already before the papacy condemned Luther, there was already academic censorship going on. So it helped establishing an anti-Lutheran mindset. This is especially so because one of the Louvain professors, Jacob van Hoogstraten, who was teaching in Cologne and in Leuven at the same time, was a Dominican, and he had also a papal brief as an inquisitor, so he could act upon his role as inquisitor and as professor. But to show how much these are patchworks of jurisdiction, we go to the very famous case of the first unfortunate death and the unfortunate execution of the first Lutherans burned at the stake. And there are Augustinians from an Antwerp cloister. And of course, this is always seen as state repression. But to make the case of the execution of 2 Augustinian monks, they needed all kinds of persons to intervene to make this a juridically closed case. So basically, they first needed the bishops of Cambrai and the bishop of Liège to both help buttress the case, because of course these were clerics, so they needed to convict clerics. The Louvain theologians helped to build the theological case, and then this is an arrest made in the Duchy of Brabant, which has an exemption to be not tried before central institutions. So the Brabant councillors needed to be on board. The papal legate, who used to be in the Netherlands, is present at the execution and the governance. And all these different instances need to collaborate to have the power. So it shows it's a patchwork of jurisdictions. I've coined this term juridical bricolage. It's not in the sense of amateurism, but in the postmodern sense that people use bits and pieces of different systems they know to make something new. And I think this is the case because of the Borderlands situation. These were bits of pieces, the edicts from the empire, the episcopal power from the enclaves and the episcopal enclaves, the papal legate who was in the Low Countries. And it is because of this very complicated patchwork of jurisdiction that the idea after some years grows that there should be one inquisition, a new inquisitorial title. And so they first do an experiment. It doesn't end well. It's a layman counselor which gets the power to be an inquisitor. The reason why I think it's a layman is because it's an old friend of the Pope and Pope Adrian. It doesn't end well because he commits fraud to make his case, and it's found out and he's fired. So in 1525 there's a new attempt to make an Inquisition, and an Inquisition which has the power to, or the power and the jurisdiction over the whole Low Countries. To make it more solid, they turned to the Prince Bishop of Liège and Louvain professors. But again, it's a function. In the beginning, 1525, there are 3 persons appointed as Inquisitors General. In the end, there are 5 at that moment. Until 1545, there are suddenly 20 Inquisitors for the whole Low Countries. They're often recruited in Leuven, or they're old Louvain disciples which have positions all over the Low Countries. But then it gets interesting because there's a whole new setup of an Inquisition, but actually what the Emperor tries to do in uniting the Low Countries being part of the Holy Roman Empire, he tries to implement Formula Reformationis. So that confessional document drafted within the religious wars in the empire, and he tries to enforce it upon the Low Countries as well as being part of the empire. And so it becomes a twin track between repression and reform. And that's what we see as well. So when there's the whole new scheme of episcopal reorganization, so there are in the end 17 bishops, and they all actually get power to persecute heretics, but even then also in Louvain there are new inquisitors appointed. So it's always seen as an overlapping jurisdiction. And so here the story, so the last part of my talk today is about these transregional transfers, how influences from the empire go into different directions, which even the emperor did not expect. And then we turn to one of these bishops. So this is Robert de Prodi. He was the very young bishop of Cambrai, present when the first Lutherans were burned in Brussels. At that time, he was not installed yet as bishop, but he was tutored by Louvain theologians, and he was sitting there with his ghostwriters next to him. At first sight, he would be the typical example of a pre-Tridentine bishop, being noble, being appointed at a young age. He studied in Louvain, that's already a bonus, but he's like this typical, he has a love affair when he's studying in Louvain, so he's this typical person who you wouldn't suspect to be an advocate of reform. But in his function as Bishop of Cambrai, he gets ordered by the Emperor that the Formula Reformationis should be introduced within Cambrai, because Cambrai directly resorts under the empire. But the aim of the emperor is, if we force the Bishop of Cambrai, he has jurisdiction until Antwerp in the Duchy of Brabant. So actually, by proclaiming in Cambrai, I can also make the Formula Reformationis, the Catholic Confession, happen in up to the estuary of the Scheldt and the main park. Robert de Prodi does convoke one of the first provincial councils after the first session, the first period of the Council of Trent. But then it gets very interesting twists, because when he pronounces the Formula Reformationis and he does his provincial council, the first thing he does is starting to publish all his decrees, his new provincial decrees in Paris. And you would think, why on earth is he publishing in Paris what is actually a thing from the empire and which should go up to Antwerp and the Low Countries? It's because he's part of a very powerful transregional family with a large pedigree. So he publishes the Acts and the Tridentine part of the Tridentine decrees, but he shows immediately, I'm also a French prince. I'm related to the House of Lorraine, the House of Luxembourg, the House of Estouteville. So he does that in a competition with the Cardinal de Guise and the Cardinal de Lorraine, the champions of Tridentine at that time, well, the politique, but also the people who try to get reform happening. So these persons which seem imperial agents have actually a lot of cultural influence, and they're also in competition with what's happening in France. And so the book which just came out last week is that green book on the noblesse transrégionale, and it shows how transregional nobilities actually were cross-border agents at the eve. This is the eve of the wars of religion, especially during the wars of religion. And so we come to our conclusion. So the Borderlands situation has really, in the Low Countries, preempted the fact that there would come a central unified institution. So there was never a Domus Inquisitionis, there was never a building, never central archives, no prisons. But there were overlapping jurisdictions to persecute heresy and to legitimate repression. And following up on the last talk, it's these overlapping jurisdictions which also make that a lot of individuals could escape persecution. They played upon fleeing from one jurisdiction to another, and so this actually created, it was a very unstable system, and it created a lot of opportunity to escape. Being on the periphery at first sight does not always mean that nothing was happening, rather on the contrary. The bishopric of Cambrai is one of the first places where the Council of Trent in Northern Europe is actually promulgated, where the bishop has to act and starts to do these visitations. So they're often on the vanguard of international developments, and this is because they have this hub function. So thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation that show also that, well, there is possibility of a great cooperation against someone. Sometimes you can have this incredible agreement of all the different powers when needed. But also, of course, well, I would say that the Netherlands, the Low Countries, well, it's quite a peculiar periphery because it's so central in Europe also that it's a periphery on the other side, on one side, on the other side, it's really at the center of many things economically and culturally. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. It was just a brief comment to give you time to think what you want to ask to both our speakers. And I guess we have quite a lot of time, but I lost sight of that. So, but I guess 20 minutes at least for discussion. Okay, yes. Yes, I tried to.
Thank you for both presentations. I'm glad to see also quite many. I had similar inputs listening to both of you, and in particular your concluding remark on overlapping jurisdictions also as a mean to strategically escape jurisdictions, so playing around it. And actually my question is for Kirsi in this respect. So it is an issue that came to my mind listening to these cases in Spain that you have mentioned. And I was wondering whether you had the impression, I don't know if the material is so abundant to have clear conclusions about it, but if you had the impression that supplications to the Pope were a strategy to escape local tribunals. So if there is this attempt to go to central authority in order to avoid inquisitorial processes on a local level. And a related question is also still on overlapping jurisdictions on cases of magic. So this looks like in the late medieval period like one of the best examples to demonstrate how there is no clear-cut distinction on what should pertain to diocesan justice or to inquisitorial or to central papal tribunals, or even to not a real tribunal, but a related office of the papal curia, such as the penitentiary. So it seems that with magic there is really more than in other cases a blurred area that you could use in a way or the other. And also I wanted to ask you, I know that prosopographical analysis is so crucial to your research also in your current project, and if you see actually overlapping competences in terms of personnel. So is it traceable that people working in for the penitentiary were actually in charge of other papal offices? So this would also be perhaps an additional hint to detect the blurred area of institutional offices dedicated to these cases. That's all. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Irene. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. You are totally right about this. I have not been looking very much. I have been going through all the petitions from the pontificate of Pius II, that is from the 1458-64. And there are a lot of these magical and heresy cases. They were the first part of my presentation. They were all from there. I have not been taking a systematic look at the later volumes regarding the Inquisition, but I have lately been in the past couple of years, I have been going through the later volumes, and there are a lot of cases from Spain, and those are clearly the kind of cases like the two last cases I presented, where it's obvious that the people have used the penitentiary documents in order to escape from the hands of the local Inquisition. And as Irene said, this is very much this kind of what the legal historians call it, some kind of justice shopping, that people are going to a place where they can be sure that they can get an answer that they can use or can have best use about in front of the local tribunals. And I think it's also very much what Violet said, this kind of border cases that people in the late Middle Ages, early modern period, they were sort of, I don't know if one can use the word abuse, but at least using the legal system, they knew where they could get what they wanted, and then they went there. And this is a thing, I think, regarding the penitentiary. We have done it a little bit. Professor Schmucke has been writing about it. I have been writing about it. Also, I think Wolfgang Müller has been writing about these things. But it is still a thing that one has not studied enough. There is much more one could say when one goes and looks at these documents. And the problem a little bit with the penitentiary sources is that we see what the people themselves had told the penitentiary, but we don't know their motivation. We don't know anything what is behind. So here, I have always said that one should combine the penitentiary documents with the local documentation that sometimes can tell a huge story behind this very short entry in the penitentiary registers. So that would also be very interesting to collaborate with you who know the Inquisition records sort of to see whether we have the same persons and what can we get out by combining these two things. And Irene's second question about the overlap with the personnel of the penitentiary. There is very little I can say about that in these cases. The penitentiary use as legal advisors the Rota judges, the auditores of the Sacra Romana Rota. So there is clearly an overlap with the juridical understanding. But at this point, I don't think I have more sort of concrete information about that thing.
I guess there were another question there, and then I saw Vincenzo, but please.
Thank you both of you for your very interesting papers. I have a question for Violet, because what struck me was your idea of putting together the trans-regional and regional nobilities and the overlapping jurisdictional structures. And I wondered if you can tell us maybe more about the using of these networks, of these family networks, in order to close loopholes or to evade jurisdiction. Thank you.
Okay.
So thank you, Andrea, for this interesting question. It's part of my ongoing research. I think we should see transregional nobilities as their own dimension, they have their own scale of operating. They're very used to be present in this borderlands, and sometimes they have been bishop appointed by help of the French king, sometimes they have been bishop appointed by imperial support, and these are the same families, but they switch sides, they hedge the beds constantly. They're very well aware of the fact that having relatives on both sides of the border can actually help them, especially for persecution. If we're talking at the moment in which Calvinism is spreading rapidly in this region. This is partially, of course, because Calvin has been born in Mayence, so this was kind of like his region before he went onto the Swiss cantons. But so there's a lot of Calvinism in that region because of there will be the Peace of Canton-Combrisi, so there won't be war, but there will be constantly like Calvinist preachers making incursions into the Netherlands and then fleeing again across the border. They think they're safe. But of course, the bishop can write to his relative governor of city X or Y to ask, can you arrest these? Or I have a suspicion these were the people who were with me. And for example, the very Calvinism, very known Calvinist author Guy Debray, who was the one who wrote the Confessio Belgica, so the most important confessional Calvinist document for the Low Countries. His family, for example, lives in Tournai, which used to be a French enclave, and the family flees across the border. Guy Debray does that as well. He flees to Salonen and then goes on his tour. But the bishop is writing to Henri de la Marque, which is the Prince Sovereign of Sedan. And he says, like, I know you have a free policy, but I don't like Guy Debray, he's causing a lot of trouble, arrest him. It doesn't happen, but you see there's this try to do it. And so, yeah, they know a lot. They've been used for centuries to control this borderlands and to work with these overlapping jurisdictions. And they have a Ken network, which is helping them.
Thank you very much. I guess Vincenzo had the question, and I'll try to have a look if also someone has a question online, so you can raise your virtual hand. then try to have a look at that.
Thank you for your interventions. Just 3 questions for Kirsi and 1 for Violet. The first one, I was wondering, Kirsi, which was the role of the penitentiary in the elaboration of the bullas in Cena Domini after the 14th century? I don't know if there is if there are news about the elaboration of the first bullas in Cena Domini. The second one, what did happen after the reform imposed by Pius V in the middle of the 16th century concerning the activities of the penitentiary and the role of Inquisition also? The third, I did not understand if the conversion to Judaism was a sin committed by conversos or by old Christians, Spanish old Christians. I can understand. For Violet, I was wondering how many men of the university, how many professors of the University of Leuven acted not as censors, but as judges of faith in the Low Countries during the early modern age? I don't know. Thank you very much.
So, Kirsi.
Yes, I have to say I don't know anything about the penitentiary and the whether they have had something to do with the developing of the In Cena Domini. I know that penitentiary has been the office that if somebody had broken against it, the penitentiary could give an absolution. And I think that the Cardinal Penitentiary has had something to do with it, but I have absolutely no idea how. I have never seen anything in the penitentiary archives because what is left from the period I have been studying until the reorganization by Pius V, it is only the incoming petitions that are recorded, so we don't know anything what happens inside the penitentiary and all these procedures. I'm sorry, I can't answer to your question about this one. The reforms of Pius V, that changed immensely the powers of the penitentiary, or practically took almost everything away. And what remained, it remained very much the tribunal doing the marital marriage dispensations, and most other powers were taken away. The last question about the Christians and conversion to Judaism, I didn't really catch what you wanted to ask.
1 second that Vincenzo came back on stage.
If the sin of apostasy was committed by old Christians or conversos, I mean conversos.
Yeah, it is not in these cases that I had. It is not said. I assume that they could have been. Probably they have been conversos, but yeah, it is not said in the document. I suppose there must have been question of conversos who have sort of relapsed, but yeah, that is the problem a little bit with the penitentiary material. We should connect them to the locals and to know who they are. The details are often missing in the very short petitions in the records.
Although, if I recall in your presentation, there was a case of circumcision, so that should not be a conversus.
Yeah, it might be the for example,
not a relapsus personally, so from a family, but not.
Yeah, it could be that the parents had been Jews and then the child has been baptized and then sort of relapse. But yeah, I don't know. It is impossible to know from these cases. It can be one, it can be the other.
Okay. And there was the Violet to reply.
Yeah, the second question by Vincenzo. Thank you for this question, because it gives me again the opportunity to show that if we limit the broad religious persecution to only the function of inquisitors in general, then we have at the moment about 50 inquisitors over the whole 16th century operating over the whole Low Countries, of which 15 would be also attached to the University of Leuven. Most often, like a special connection, I think, then was between, if you were so of course the chairs in theology, there were also canons of St. Peter's, and if you were the dean of St. Peter's, the local collegiate church, then you were automatically Inquisitor General. So there's a very special nexus between that. You see that also when they write to Philip II, the dean of St. Peter's has died, he thinks, oh, we need new inquisitors, while actually they had just been appointing for the new bishops. Also, if you look at the appointment of new bishops, of the new appointments made, 4 out of 14 had already first been professor in Leuven, but also inquisitor in Leuven. And one of them, so I've been able to reconstruct that. And so when he's serving as the new, it's a new function, so it's the new Bishop of Bruges, but he uses his old inquisitorial title to proceed to the reconciliation of heretics. Because of course, we just heard it, the reconciliation of repentant heretics is the casus reservatus, one of the casus reservati of the Pope. So you need a papal permission to do that. So he uses his old letter to actually proceed, so not his episcopal power. But in the end, there are very few, so there are only 15 professors of Leuven, and what always strikes me is that there's also no institutional memory about the inquisitorial function. When Bius, for example, gets asked to prove that the Louvain inquisitors have always performed the inquisition of faith on subjects of Brabant, he needs to go to notaries himself. So the archives are not kept by his colleagues, or he and his colleague are searching for the notary archives, and they find some cases, but not all cases. Like today, I've recovered more cases than they did in the 16th century. But this is just showing that there was no kind of like institutional memory. It was not that Bius, when he was asked the question, could say, oh, but my predecessor Tapper had done this, or there was a list, or there was something. No, he had to do the inquiry, he had to act like a historian and go to notaries. So that's why I think it's always difficult to fit the Low Countries in the large pattern. It's certainly not one of the Mediterranean inquisitions, which are hugely organized.
Thank you. Please.
So my name is Elena Bonora, and I have a question for Kirsi and one for Violet. And the one for Kirsi is, thank you for your talk, and I really admire your work, because I just didn't know the documentation of the penitentiary, and it's such a huge documentation. So I was wondering, which is the perspective of your research? I mean, on which registers are you working, and which are the problems, the focus of the research you are developing on this documentation? And the other question is for Violet. Is you said that the Borderlands are the avant-garde of international development of Catholicism. And would you please explain what did you mean by this strong energy? Thank you.
Please, Kirsi.
Wow, what should I answer? I have been sitting whatever 12 years in the archives and gone through these registers. I have mainly used the medieval registers, that is from the 1450s until 1530s or so. And I think I have been through all of them. It is about 100 registers each, about 300-400 folios. I think I have been them all through 3-4 times for different purposes. First of all, I have been making the edition of the Finnish and Swedish documentation, and then I have sort of been going through all the volumes and finding the Scandinavian cases. Then another one, I went through all the volumes from the pontificate of Pius II, as I said, transcribed all the 15,000 documents from his pontificate. And then I've been looking at the sort of at European level, what kind of cases the penitentiary was actually handling, regional variations, and I have been writing articles about the marriage cases. Ludwig Schmucke has been writing so much about the illegitimacy cases that I have not concentrated on that. I have been writing something about the violence, something about the confessional letters, something about the ordinations. So I think I have been doing a little bits with all kinds of cases. My main interest is, of course, because I'm interested about the canon law background. So I am looking at what were the problems with the canon law and how they were solved through applying to the penitentiary. Yeah, the problem is that there are so many interesting cases. I must have transcribed 20,000 cases or something. I have a huge base of all kinds of cases, and it is a little bit, if somebody comes and could you come and write an article about the corruption, then I can come. Yeah, I have here 200 cases that I can write an article about or something. So at the moment, this is a sort of my hobby. I have no project with the penitentiary at the moment, but I'm always happy to talk about them and come back to some cases and do a small article here or there. I hope I answered to your question.
Yes, you answered. She said Elena Bonora.
And to follow up on that, it's also a fascinating question. Today I made the argument that actually what happened in the borderlands of Cambrai was implementing Trent, and the Council of Trent and Tridentine Catholicism actually kind of originated from these borderlands. If we look at, it's an anecdote, but I think it's a very telling anecdote. The Council of Trent could also have been the Council of Metz or the Council of Cambrai. If you look at what Francis I and Charles V agreed on the Peace of Crépy, in 1544 they agreed that there should be a ecumenical council, and it could be in Cambrai, in Metz, or in Trent. And it became Trent, of course, because it was closest to the papacy and to the Roman Curia. But it shows also that these kind of borderlands were the bilingual borderlands, and there were always frictional zones. Trent, Italian, German-speaking, Metz, German, French-speaking, Cambrai, French, Dutch-speaking. Like these were the kind of corridor. We always say also the corridor with the fiercest witch hunts. There's also the corridor with very radical Catholicism eventually. But I think, so now today I've shown it for Tridentine Catholicism. I think if you go further into the wars of religion, this is mostly also the zone where a lot of refuge takes place. Because you can escape borders, you just escape to the border closest to you where you're safe, and you wait until you can return to the homeland. So, for example, for Calvinism, it's clear that in Emden, which today is a very peripheral town in Germany, but this was a hotspot of international Calvinism. There were a lot of Calvinists drafting there. If I look at Cambrai, this became a hotspot for eventually Catholic refuge. So there were a lot of Catholic migrants coming from England, also Catholics persecuted by Calvinist regimes in the northern Netherlands came to there, and when French Calvinism was very fierce in the wars of religion, there were Catholic ligueurs which also came to Cambrai. So you have a melting pot of all exiled Catholics who use the printing press to reach out to their homeland. And that's been one of our research projects. The Transregional Catholicism project has been to document how Cambrai at the border became this melting pot of all these influences. And what you see, and that was not the expectation from the beginning, is that they not only publish in their own language, but they especially start to switch back to Latin. Because in Latin they can make a more universal message. And you see that, for example, there's a circulation of martyrs. English martyrs become suddenly interesting for Low Countries. They've never been to such an extent, but they've become through this melting pot. The martyrs of Gorkum, which are Dutch martyrs, become suddenly interesting. Then the stories about the Japanese martyrs become very compelling for all sorts. And these borderlands, they become a kind of like melting pot in which people think about their own experience of refuge, exile, persecution, and they make a more radical image or version of Catholicism and then start spreading it.
Okay. I see still 2 questions that will be the last 2, so it's there. And then we will have our break.
Thank you very much. It will be very quick. And first of all, thank you to both speakers for their very interesting papers. I have a question for Violet, Soen. I was wondering whether in this very special area where where borders generated experiences of contamination and mixing and melting pots, as you said. I was wondering whether there is some specificity regarding the matters prosecuted by this bricolage of tools of repression that you highlighted, not only doctrinal, but also relating to social discipline, for example. I was thinking about the topic of mixed marriage, which mixes the doctrinal and the behavior and the social. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Indeed, because I've been talking a lot about the jurisdiction and maybe less about the content, why were you persecuted? And it's often alleged, and it's even also said as such by Philip II, that in the Low Countries there was the harshest anti-heresy legislation in place in the whole of Europe, because in fact the repression of religious persecution not only happened to heresy as such or the beliefs, it mainly happened through deeds. So things which you did, which was an activity, and the imperial placards, they list a lot of activities, singing psalms, Calvinist psalms, singing psalms, reading the Bible. So it's a lot of activities, but also activities associated to spreading the Reformation. So, for example, if you hosted, let's say, a Protestant-minded person fleeing, and you hosted that person, you also fell under this anti-heresy law. And so there, for example, a lot of debates about people who have an auberge, alberigo, I don't know, the auberge, who have a hostel, but if they, so this is a paid activity, so they actually have received money, for example, and they say, I didn't know that this person was fleeing, he just paid me, and even that can get you in trouble. You often get a letter of pardon afterwards, but like there was a very large network, and there was also a lot of spying, of course, spies who tell to the local official, well, he has done something wrong. They're often, that's also something we see, we talked yesterday about gender. The persecution, the people persecuted or executed are often men. Women are often getting letters of pardon, they're there of course, but the persecution is mainly like they arrest the men because they had set the bad example. So, but there's a whole scale of activities, and then we see at least when the Low Countries again become, the Habsburg Low Countries become Catholic, and there's a Catholic restoration. So there's an immediate drop in heresy cases and an immediate steep curve in witch hunts. So they kind of correlate. Their colleague of mine and someone might you know, Erik Aerts and Dries van Isager, they have written about socioeconomic patterns behind these two curves, like crossing at one point. But there's a whole range of activities, and it's maybe even more pronounced than if you would live in France or in the Empire, where you would have needed to do much worse things to get persecuted than in the Netherlands.
Thank you. And then the final question for this session.
Thank you. This is a question for Kirsi. Thank you for this very rich paper. I worked on penitentiary material many years ago, and I can confirm what you said, that sometimes the petition is just like the tip of the iceberg of a story that, when documents do survive, shows all its complexity at the local level. In the case I studied, a priest was condemned for sorcery by the Inquisition in Modena, and he appealed to the penitentiary and was absolved a year later. So it worked as a sort of counter power to the Inquisition. That was in the 1510s, so later. My question is, stems from my own research, although I haven't done any research on the penitentiary since then, so a long time ago. Is it possible to know the channels and the mediations, the connections through which someone who was petitioning the penitentiary would reach the penitentiary? So how easy was the access to the penitentiary by the petitioner? Did you have to know someone that would put you in contact with the penitentiary? Would you petition directly from your locality? What was the procedure? Because I think in my case, something that I wasn't able to discover was whether behind the ability of this single priest in Modena to reach the penitentiary rapidly and successfully, whether that there was some kind of local network of support that would enable him to reach Rome so easily and effectively. So can we know in which ways the petitioners would reach the penitentiary? What kind of networks were they able to use for their appeals? Thank you.
That is again one of these questions that it is totally impossible to answer based on the penitentiary sources, because there is nothing in those. Sometimes in the later volumes from about 1500 onwards, the penitentiary records contain the name of the proctor who has taken care of the handling, but that doesn't say very much either. In the penitentiary conference, we have been talking very much about this issue, and it seems also that there are some regional variation in this. In Italy, I mean, it was closer to the papal curia, and people could more easily also come personally to Rome, or where the curia in each moment was, and then try to find somebody who could lead them to a penitentiary proctor, who then took it to the right office. I have noticed from the Scandinavian context that it is very often a bunch of petitions from one diocese or even two neighboring dioceses. They come at the same time. When, for example, the bishop sends somebody to Rome to take care of some administrative business, then this representative takes with him 3-4 petitions at the same time, and then they are brought to the penitentiary. So I think there are differences. Another thing is that if one has these sort of marriage dispensations or illegitimacy dispensations and such things that are not so urgent, then they were probably more often sent to Rome by some representative who was going, while those persons who absolutely needed an absolution exactly now, they then very often actually left and they were present in Rome personally, and then went to the penitentiary. And there must have been, I think it was Andreas Maja who told something, yeah, there must have been a post box in the Vatican administration that people could just drop in their applications, and then there was somebody distributing it to the right office. This was, of course, it was a sort of meant not totally seriously, but there must have been kind of system in the curia. Maybe when people came to the St. Peter's Church, there have been people sitting somewhere and telling the tourists that, okay, if you want this, go there. If you want that, go there. We don't know. But it is extremely interesting question, because as also Irene said, there were a lot of different papal administration or offices, and there was a lot of overlapping, and who took care of this and who took care of that, and where things ended up. We don't know, and that would be very interesting to know.
So thank you for your answer, and thank you again to both the speakers and to the lively discussion that we had. Now it's time for us for a nice break till 11 and 5. No, 11. So we have just 15 minutes of to